Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Broadcast Amendment Bill 2017, Bill number 10 of 2017. This proposed amendment bill further defines the powers and functions, many which already exist under the Broadcasting Act of 2011. This amendment bill seeks to do four very important things. It seeks to provide an unambiguous, fair, and equitable licensing regime. It seeks to prohibit hate speech, racial incitement, and terror threats. It provides for the protection of international agreements with broadcasting agencies, and it provides for a commitment from broadcasting agencies to provide 1 hour a day of public service programming. One of the functions of the Broadcasting Authority, Mr. Speaker, is in the Substantive Act of 2011, which at Section 18(2)(k) reads, "The authority shall require licensees to carry a certain percentage of public service broadcasts or development support broadcasts as public information deems appropriate as a public service at no cost." Public service broadcast has always been a mandatory thing. What this amendment bill seeks to define is what a certain percentage would be by providing that it be 1 hour every 24 hours, which in fact amounts to a mere 4% every day. Mr. Speaker, in most countries across the world, and a quick look on the internet will show you that nearly all countries provide requirements for public service broadcasting. At this point, I'd like to refer to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Telecommunications Act, Act 4 of 2001. Concessions for the operation of a public telecommunications network and/or provisions for public telecommunications and/or broadcast services. And under the heading and the category used by government, Section D30, it says here, the concessionaire shall, on a free of charge basis, up to a limit of 14 hours per calendar week, 14 hours per calendar week, and thereafter at an agreed rate not exceeding 87.5% of the concessionaire's regular commercial rate for similar broadcast transmissions. They must transmit any program, announcement, information, other material which the government may require to be transmitted in a matter of public interest during the concessionaire's ordinary business offices. And it goes on to say, such material shall, up to a limit of 1 hour per day, be transmitted without accompanying advertisements. Mr. Speaker, what I tried to show by raising the example of Trinidad and Tobago is that Trinidad and Tobago, in its own legislation, has put in force even a larger period. We're talking about 1 hour a day for the full 7 days. So, Mr. Speaker, we want to look, because I recognize that a lot of criticisms have been levied against this 1 hour a day. The requirement, Mr. Speaker, really should be looked at as giving back. The people of Guyana own the airwaves, not the opposition. He gave licenses away like he owned them, but he did not own them. The people of Guyana own them, and they deserve good programming, programming that informs and educates, especially in emergency situations. Mr. Speaker, if we look back at our flood of 2005, it is interesting to note that the first entity that came offline and was not in a position to provide any public service information on how to treat your water, how to dispose of waste, and all the other need-to-know information our population needed at that point in time, immediately to just ensure and guarantee safe health. The agency that came offline was the National Communication Network. It therefore is absolutely mandatory that public service broadcasting be an important aspect and an important requirement of any private or public sector broadcasting entity. Mr. Speaker, in the usual ranting and raving that we see coming from the other side quite often, I want to say that not careful analysis was given to what the Act actually says. It says up to 60 minutes, meaning that the requirement could be anywhere from 1 minute to 60 minutes. And Mr. Speaker, being a broadcaster myself in the past, I'd like to remind individuals that producing an hour of public service announcements as clearly defined in the Act is far more difficult than we think it is. So the concept of airing public service programming is not at all draconian as the opposition would like the public to believe. At any time, broadcasters may also voice their objections to the content and will be offered a hearing on the issue of the particular content that it may find objectionable. And of course, I want to say that in response to the opposition's contention that broadcasters will be forced to air government propaganda, as I mentioned in the Act itself, the proposed bill provides that the broadcaster may file a complaint to the Broadcasting Authority. Mr. Speaker, the opposition also objects to the amendment to prohibit hate speech, racial incitement, and terror threats. In fact, last night, my learned colleague on the other side, the last speaker, spoke and raised the fact that this quite often was available and part of other legislation. But I'd like to say to the learned gentleman that that is precisely, yes, I know it's in the Constitution, but it is precisely because this is such an important issue that we feel it must be repeated in the context of a broadcasting authority and license. Mr. Speaker, we allocate broadcasting licenses and the use of the spectrum to individuals and companies that must use it in a careful and respectful manner, considering the needs of our entire population. This, in any civilized state, race hate, racial incitement, terror threats cannot be tolerated. There is no constitutional right to hate speech. No one, in fact, should want to broadcast hate speech or incite racial division. And, Mr. Speaker, we must be aware that even today, there is a radio station that's bordering on very close to that. So that's even more reason why we need to ensure it is in the legislation. Mr. Speaker, let me remind the members of the opposition that the mandatory functions of the authority includes in Section 18(1)(b) that the authority shall issue licenses for such terms not exceeding 10 years and subject to such conditions related to circumstances of the license as the authority deems necessary for the implementation of the broadcasting policy as set up in Section 19. The amendment bill, the declared policy in Section 19Q states, ensures compliance with the Constitution, the laws of Guyana, and shall not incite violence, ethnic or religious, cultural hostility. Hence, hate speech, racial incitement were all, in fact, declared policy within the Broadcasting Act. The amended bill seeks to make absolutely clear to those who wish to engage in these acts that it will not be tolerated. Guyana has to move forward from the days of ethnic division, hate, and violence to a place where all Guyanese can enjoy civilized discourse and debate. And these amendments set us in the right direction. Mr. Speaker, I want to refer to a quote from the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, which again was referred to in the discussions and the presentations on this new amendment bill. And I quote the Honorable Leader of the Opposition: "If we allow this bill to succeed, it would be the beginning of the end of press freedom in Guyana. And so I urge people in this country to read the bill." Mr. Speaker, I want to use this opportunity and this piece of paper to remind the people of this country of the realities of press freedom right here in Guyana over the last 10 to 20 years. The Honorable Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Jagdeo, prevented all TV stations from expanding coverage to most of the country. NCN was allowed to do that, the only station allowed to do that. And remember last night we spoke about what? Freedom of the press, freedom of expression, standing aside and not interfering with the private sector. Okay. Well, we know what happened. In those days, NCN was the only agency that was allowed to...
Honorable Minister, the Honorable Gail Teixeira, you rise on a point of order. Pardon? 40A.
Can the honourable member say what reference is she making to that allegation about the Leader Opposition, who's not here to defend himself, so that the allegation she's making is incorrect, but I'd like to know what her source is. It's absolutely incorrect. Absolutely incorrect, sir. And she knows that. She knows that it's incorrect, and she's misleading this House.
Honourable Member, I thank the Honourable Member. Honourable Minister, please.
I have to admit last night when I was hearing the presentations, I wondered if all Guyanese had lived in the same place that I had lived. But nonetheless, we have the sources here. I have it in a series of articles, and Mr. Speaker, I would like to present them after in the interest of time.
Are the sources. I hope it is not from certain opinion makers and not from facts, sir.
Mr. Speaker?
Honourable members, when you rise on a point of order, the rules are not suspended. There's a particular process to be followed, and I remind members of that.
Mr. Speaker, in the case of Vidya Narayan Lewis of Community Broadcasting Network against the government of Guyana, and I think I have a colleague here that can provide even more information, but that was outlined in the case. And I do not have the case number. I can get the case number, but that in fact was one of the occasions when Mr. Jagdeo took this community religious broadcaster off the air, and thank goodness on this occasion the courts ruled in her favor. The National Frequency Management Unit is now in the process of issuing that license. Mr. Speaker, let us go back to the days when ads were withdrawn from Kaieteur News and also Stabroek News. In fact, Stabroek News in 2006, as we all know, lost a large percentage of its advertising. And interestingly, on their 10th anniversary, I'd like to quote what Stabroek News said. And here they're referring to the Honorable Leader of the Opposition. Given his tight control of the government, it was believed that the decision to end ads to Stabroek News came directly from Jagdeo. The intention behind the cutoff to Stabroek News became clear when plans for launching a newspaper by Jagdeo's friend, I will not say the name, were announced. Analysts say that the withholding of ads to Stabroek News was aimed at forcing out business and to clear the way for the Guyana Times, which was eventually launched in June 2008. This date was also significant to the end of the 17-month boycott. Stabroek News suffered for 17 months as it cleared the way for the government to begin advertising with the Guyana Times. And of course, Kaichor News lost its share of advertising in 2009 to 2010. Both papers proffered all sorts of reasons for the withdrawal, but none understood what the real reason was until the Guyana Times was launched. And then most recently, as we all know, but again, I'd be happy to lay over any proof, Mr. Jagdeo gave radio and TV licenses to a series of his family and friends. Many others were restricted. Of a particular note is the fact that the Guyana Times, the last daily to open and function.
I remember, Mr. Shearer, you rise on a point of order, ma'am?
48. The honourable member says that they have been given to a list of members of the Leader of the Opposition's family. I therefore have the list of agencies that were given licenses by the GNBA, and not one of them is a member of Mr. Jagdeo's family. I'm asking for her to withdraw the statement. Withdraw it, sir.
I thank the honourable member. I thank the honourable member for his statement. Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, I have so much more to say that I am more than happy to withdraw it until we get the DNA evidence. Mr. Speaker, the University of Guyana has had an application in for a license for many, many years. And it is strange. Stabroek News also had a license in there for many, many years. But yet, only Guyana Times was issued with a license. How do we explain that? And then on a personal note, you know, every time I stand up, I seem to be speaking on a personal note. But I also want to remind the members of the opposition that amongst the many qualified individuals that over the period of 2 decades, that never ever was granted a license or even entitled or invited to discuss the possibility of getting a license was the founder of the Caribbean News Agency, the founder of the Caribbean Broadcasting Association, a retired broadcast professional who retired from the United Nations at one of the highest levels, but of course his qualifications and experience to be granted a license under the previous government was not good enough. I want to remind us, and it's documented again when we talk about freedom of the press and freedom of expression, that a sitting president of the Press Association of Guyana, and we all know who that is, Go Mosley, was banned from entering State House and the office of president just because he did not like the coverage. This is, of course, the leader of the opposition, did not like the coverage he got while speaking at the Guyanese diaspora at a town hall meeting in Antigua. To the honorable last speaker on this motion, on this bill, I say, where is your freedom of expression there? At the highest level, the level of a former president. And Mr. Speaker, let's talk about CNS. First of all, the former government ensured that they unilaterally ordered Mr. Sharma to move from Channel 12 to Channel 6 because we wanted to give that channel to NCN. Mr. Sharma, as we all know, had to bear the cost and the massive disruptions associated with the move, including replacing a transmission and other equipment that functioned at Channel 6. And then let's go if we want to talk about ensuring I've got my facts. The Guyana Company Limited, October 3rd, 2001. As we all know, poor Mr. Sharma, who in fact is one of the best broadcasters, because we have to remember that ages ago, a couple years ago, when we had flooding in all those interior and areas, it was Mr. Sharma that went out in the fields and brought us information on those floods. And it was outside his office that Guyanese got up and lined up to raise funds for a child with hydrocephalus, to raise money and funds for individuals suffering with flooded areas. And yet, what do? Mr. Sharma's request to expand his license was never considered. In fact, we shut him down on many, many occasions. And so I want to refer to the headline of the Gleaner. Guyana's president has banned an opposition television station for broadcasting for 4 months after authorities accused it of airing a slanderous comment about a close presidential associate. And do we know who that close presidential associate is? Need I say any more? We heard from him last night. And then it goes on to say, officials shut CNS TV down for 4 months last year after the station broadcast footage showing Jagdeo dancing at a party and saying he was celebrating while much of the city and the coast were flooded by rains, record rains. And again, check the source. It's the Guyana Company Limited, online. Trust me, I'm not in your league of propaganda at all. I wish I was. But Mr. Speaker, I want to now go to a couple of other things. We heard yesterday about the importance of the private sector and how they were being affected and how badly treated this administration is treating them. And there's nothing that could be further from the truth. I want to refer to the GINA report, July 19th, 2007. It's right here. I'm willing to get it copied and show you. Okay, so what does it say? First line, regularizing cable providers' operations was the centerpiece of talks today as head of state President Barry Jagdeo met cable operators at his office in New Garden Street. Okay, and then it goes on to say, last paragraph, the office of the president served notices of closure 2 weeks ago on Infinity Telecommunications, Inc., the Linden Cable Network, 2 operators in Linden, Bartica Communications Network, and another operator in Bartica. And then it goes on to say that Atlantic Cable Network, which is based in Bagotstown, East Bank, Demerara, was told to cease expanding its network and for the company to limit its operation to 2 villages along the east bank of Demerara. And it's so funny because it says, quite rightly, that Atlantic Cable Network was in operation till 2001. Ladies and gentlemen, members of this honorable house, the public out there, just do a little research and see what other cable companies were allowed to operate at that time. Your research will show only 2. And certainly, again, friends and, we don't want to say family, but friends of you-know-who. So I would like to say to the honorable member on the other side, the honorable honorable member Edgehill, that you talk about competition. You spoke about a hands-off approach. This is just absolute proof of the contrary.
Honourable Minister, Honourable Member, you have risen on a point of order. Honourable Minister, would you yield?
Many occasions about saying you
Is this
are
a
not
point? Is this a
referring to the honourable
point of
member.
order, Honourable Member?
Yes, comrade, we're asking for the honourable member to approach the honourable members in this house with some appropriate behaviour. She says you all the time, and especially the leader opposition.
I thank
you
the
are
honourable member.
cautious, sir, on this side of the house. I hope that you will also do likewise on that side of the house.
Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is absolutely correct. I had no right to refer to the most honourable member as you. I apologize. At this point in time, the honourable member, as you will remember last night, made reference to a very important piece, a newspaper article. And again, as I will repeat, the Broadcasting Amendment Bill 2017, an assault on press freedom. And there's an important quote. This is one area that the honourable member on the other side and I see eye to eye. So there, the honourable member, the former Attorney General, Mr. Nandalal, is quoted here, and he says, the bill, I'm paraphrasing part of it, but he goes on to say, here's the quote, the freedom to receive ideas and information without interference, freedom to communicate ideas and information without interference, freedom to hold opinions without interference, protection of private property from compulsory acquisition by the state without payment of adequate compensation, and the freedom to hold and publish political views of one's choice is, as he said, not included in here, and therefore this is an assault. Well, my friends, freedom of expression. I want to remind you of that young man below the age of 18 who showed a finger to a motorcade, and who was arrested, and I understand sent to jail for a short space of time. So much for freedom of expression. And I also want to mention that in 2001, HBTV Channel 9 was also briefly suspended. I want to remind the public too that the lottery broadcast was yanked from Vera Communication Network, Channel 28 in those days, and of course it was given to NCN, and that of course started to spell the end of that station, of course, and its former owner. And then of course the government at that time took TBN, the church broadcast, and also yanked that from the then Channel 28. And then, of course, as you know, in 2002, Mr. Sharma was banned for the airwaves. And then, of course, we all know, because I was part of the protest too, I stood there when Mr. Sharma's transmitter was actually forcibly removed from his property. We all remember those. And then, of course, we know that even Mr. Mark Benchcop had some challenges. We know that no frequencies were allocated to the University of Guyana. And then we know exactly what happened in the very end of the tenure of the last government. But Mr. Speaker, given all the complaints and all the hysteria that the honorable leader of the opposition likes to create, and the members on the other side, I know that I have in my presentation reminded the people of Guyana of our history. Now, it is interesting to note that I have a document here that is a report on the legal proceedings, and I want to quote the former Chief Justice. And I want to say that I don't necessarily agree with what he's saying, but certainly this was an indication of the thinking of the time. So Chief Justice Acting Ian Chang says that while no applicant has an absolute right to to a license to operate a radio or TV station, nor do residents have an absolute right to receive information. Need I say anything else? So, Mr. Speaker, there are a couple of things I want to mention in closing. I want to quote the Honorable Member, Mr. Edgell, who talked about what is taking place in our country. And I want to say that is what took place in our country. Got a little confused, but we understand. And when we talk about the importance, and again I quote him, the importance of being able to seek, receive, and impart information, direct quote, I say, remember Lyndon and that scenario. And then when we talk about fundamental freedoms of expression, I want you to remember that young man who put his finger up and ended up, we know where he ended up. And then we know that the honorable member on the other side, the last speaker last night, talked about the right of a legitimate expectation. And that's a very, very important point, because that's what we hear them saying over and over and over in the press, right? Well, I want to ask you a question. If you come into my house and you steal my TV, do you have a legitimate expectation after the police find you to keep my TV? I thought you would understand and relate to that. No, never. And therefore, if there are licenses that were given out on less than fair and acceptable levels, we have to ensure that we have a system in place that makes sure that it cannot happen again. Mr. Speaker, in closing, again I quote the honorable member, my friend on the other side, who spoke about this bill stifling and frustrating civil liberties. And he also spoke about intimidation. Mr. Speaker, there was no more intimidation than when I personally went to NCN in 2011, check in hand, saying, this is the National Broadcasting Company. I want to pay for ads for the AFC. Here is my placement order. Here is my money. And I was refused, and the AFC was refused on several occasions. So when you talk about intimidation and pushing a political agenda, what can I say? But nothing could be further than the truth. I want to say to the broadcasters out there that I know you're concerned about the 1 hour. And I will step out of line and say that I want you to understand the way that this can be looked at. There is insufficient public service announcements in Guyana, on the television, on radio. And this, in fact, is an opportunity for private broadcasters to produce such material themselves. And therefore, in my understanding of the legislation, when it says up to 1 hour, imagine if a television station or a broadcasting company, as is required in other parts of the world, they are required to produce programming. If they were to produce their own public service announcements on a range of different issues, I am sure that that could be counted as part of the 1 hour programming. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I want to say that we want to work with the broadcasters. I want to say that I remember in around 1995, reading in the papers a horror story of a minibus going around the corner very close to the Ocean View International Hotel. And the minibus ended up in the water. And in there, in the water, on the TV the night, I saw the driver of the minibus coming out. He was clearly and understandably very, very visually upset, in tears, and he was lamenting the fact that he had lost his wife and his small baby. And one of the things that struck in my mind was the fact that he said that when the baby come out, the baby was breathing, but we couldn't do anything. I want to fast forward to about 2 months ago when a young man was pulled out of the water at the seawall. And I watched a clip on television where they were saying, "BT belly, BT belly." And then somebody else said, "Turn him over, turn him over." Mr. Speaker, I use those two examples to show that there is insufficient public service announcements on our airwaves. The reason why all the individuals at that accident and on that seawall the other day could do nothing is because Guyanese do not know how to do CPR. Most people are not confident enough to do it. And I say that if you look at the broadcast networks in any other country, they produce their own programming. And therefore, I say to the private broadcasters, we are here to work with you. I am currently working with them on several issues, including the transition from analog to digital. And we together want to build a better Guyana. We want to build citizens that are informed, are educated, that have the requisite skills to deal with all kinds of challenges and situations that come our way. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I have no hesitation in supporting the passage of this bill.